Hello children, today we will discuss chapter 1 of political science. What is democracy? Why democracy? And today we will discuss only the first part of the chapter. We are all familiar with the word democracy. In the lower classes, we have come across this word many a times. So, this word means demos, that is the people, and kratos means to rule. So, simply put, democracy means rule by the people. We have studied about democracy, but in order to understand democracy better, we need to know how it differs from other forms of government. In democratic governments, the rulers are elected by the people and hence they are accountable and responsible for them. In non-democratic governments, the ruler's position is hereditary or he comes to power by seizing it by force. In democratic governments, people enjoy rights which have been given to them by the constitution, whereas in non-democratic governments, citizens do not enjoy any rights. In democratic governments, the government cannot be absolute. It cannot rule according to its own wishes, but has to rule within the limits set by the constitution and respect the rights of citizens. Whereas in non-democratic governments, the government may exercise absolute powers and can also be dictatorial. So, since democracy is a rule by the people, it has become the most successful political idea in the world, and the concept of democracy has now spread to all countries of the world barring a few. At the same time, there are countries which are democratic but are not true democracies because they do not fulfill all the criteria that is required to be termed as democracies. But we must remember that the common factor that is there in all democracies is that it is a form of government in which the rulers are elected by the people. But this is again not enough. In a democracy, surely the people are the source of all power. In their hands lies the destiny of their rulers. But at the same time, merely electing rulers does not make a country a democracy. So, there are various other factors to be considered. In a democracy, the rulers are elected by the people. But certain questions arise. Who are these rulers? Which officials must be elected and which decisions can be taken by those non-elected officials? For example, in a country like ours, we also have civil servants who are not elected but they also have certain powers. Secondly, what are the conditions for a democratic election? Third, who are the people who can elect? And fourthly, can the elected leaders rule as they wish, or are there any limits set on their rules? These are certain questions that come to our mind, the answers of which we will gather as we move ahead with this chapter. To understand this, we will study about certain countries like Pakistan, China, Mexico and Zimbabwe, where although certain conditions of democracy were fulfilled, we still cannot term them as complete democracies. Pakistan. In October 1999, General Pervez Musharraf led a military coup and a democratically elected government lost its power. He declared himself as the chief executive of the country. Nowhere in a democracy can a person come to power by seizing it and declaring himself as the chief executive of the country. Pakistan thus went into the hands of the army. There was military rule in Pakistan. General Musharraf changed his designation. He held a referendum in 2002. If you remember, children, in the last chapter, we were familiar with this term referendum, which means a direct vote from the people. So, he held a referendum and gave himself a 5-year extension. The Pakistani media and the human rights activists put forth that this referendum was based on fraud and malpractices. In August 2002, General Musharraf issued a legal framework order amending the constitution and giving himself the power to dismiss the national and provincial assemblies. Can you compare this situation to a country like ours? Can the president dissolve the national and provincial assemblies? Can the president amend the constitution on his own? It is not really permitted in a democracy. After issuing the legal framework order, it was declared that elections would be held to the national and the provincial assemblies. But these elected representatives had very limited power. Then again we come to the question, if the elected representatives did not enjoy power, who enjoyed power in Pakistan? Power was in the hands of the National Security Council, which was dominated by the military officers, and these military officers supervised the civilian cabinet. Who were the members of the civilian cabinet? The elected representatives. Did they take any decisions? No, because they were supervised by the Security Council. So the Security Council literally ran the state. So in Pakistan, we now know that the people elected their representatives, but those elected representatives did not have the power to take important decisions. So, just like any other democracy, there was an elected parliament and there was a government, but their role was minimal. So, who enjoyed most of the power here? The real power was in the hands of General Musharraf and the army. The question here is, were these people elected by the citizens? These people were not elected by the citizens. So, this cannot be called people's rule. Why cannot we call Pakistan a democracy, or why isn't it people's rule? Because those in power were not chosen by the people. From the discussion on Pakistan, we conclude that in a country, if the elected representatives do not hold power, the country cannot be called a true democracy. Coming to this, we get our first feature of democracy, which says that in a democracy, the final decision-making power must rest with those elected by the people. Then we go on to discuss about the next country. This is China, which, as we all know, has a single party system. The Parliament of China which is called the National People's Congress, appoints the president. It has nearly 3,000 members elected from all over the country and some elected by the army. The Chinese Communist Party is the only party that exists, so the candidates who contest for elections in China need to be approved by the Communist Party. Only members of the Chinese Communist Party and its allied smaller parties, 8 in number, are allowed to contest in the elections. So, we have seen that in China, elections do take place regularly. The citizens also enjoy voting rights. But can we call China a true democracy? The answer is no. Holding elections is not sufficient to term a country as a true democracy. The Chinese people had the right to vote, but the elections in China did not offer any real choice to the people because they did not have any alternatives. They had to choose the ruling party and the candidates approved by the ruling party. So, since there is only one party, there is no opposition to bring out the faults of the ruling party to the public eye. From the example of China, we learn the second important feature of democracy, which we will complete after we discuss about Mexico. From China, we learn that elections are not enough. Giving people the right to vote is not enough. Elections must offer choice to the people. Then we move on to Mexico. Elections in Mexico are held once every 6 years from the time Mexico has attained independence. But until 2000, elections were always won by the Institutional Revolutionary Party or the PRI. This PRI definitely had something to it to be coming back to power after every election. The PRI won the elections every time. What were the reasons for this? Opposition parties contested, but they never managed to win the elections. The PRI used dirty tricks and unfair means to win the elections and also spent a lot of money on campaigning during the elections. The government employees were pressurized to attend the party meetings of the PRI and the government school teachers forced the parents to vote for the PRI. In the last minute, the polling booths were shifted from one place to another, causing a lot of inconvenience to the people who came to cast their votes. So we see that the PRI was coming to power by using unfair means which should not be permitted in a democracy. In Mexico, we see that unlike China, there was an opposition party. Elections were held. The people had choices, but even then, we cannot term Mexico as a true democracy. Why? The answer is because though it seemed that the people had a lot of choice, but in practice the elections were not free and fair because the opposition was not allowed to function. The PRI dominated the country. The opposition did not have any meaning. Elections were not fair. So just having elections, just offering choice to the people and giving the people voting rights does not make a country a democracy unless and until the elections are free and fair. From what we have already discussed about China and Mexico, Putting both the examples together, we conclude the second feature of democracy. So, a democracy must be based on free and fair elections where those currently in power have a fair share of losing in the next elections. It is not that one party is going to remain in power and come back to power in every subsequent election. Having discussed the second feature of democracy, we move on to the next country. Here, the most important principle of democracy comes into play, which is universal adult franchise. We already know in the previous chapter what universal adult franchise is. Just to refresh you a little, it is giving voting rights to all adults. So, universal adult franchise meant giving voting rights to all. This is a very important principle of democracy because it is based on political equality. But in today's world, are there still countries where this is not practiced, where this does not apply to the citizens? Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is a country where until 2015 the women did not have the right to vote. In Estonia, the citizenship rules make it very difficult for the Russian minority to get the right to vote. In Fiji, the electoral system gives more value to the vote of an indigenous Fiji than that of an Indian Fiji. So from these three examples, we know that still countries exist where the right to vote is not enjoyed by all the citizens in an equal measure. Democracy, as we know, is based on the fundamental principle of political equality. This was not enjoyed by the people in the countries that we discussed, Saudi Arabia, Estonia and Fiji. So there was no universal adult franchise. So in real terms, these countries cannot be called democratic countries as the principle of universal adult franchise does not apply here. From our discussion about Saudi Arabia, Estonia and Fiji, we conclude the third feature of democracy. That is, each adult citizen must have one vote and each vote must have one value. Coming to this, we have completed discussing the third feature of democracy. Now we move on to Zimbabwe, a country in Africa. Zimbabwe attained independence in 1980 and since then the party that led the freedom struggle, ZANU-PF, ruled the country. Elections were held regularly, but it was always won by ZANU-PF using unfair means. President Robert Mugabe changed the constitution to make himself more powerful and less accountable. This is something which is practically impossible in a democracy where the government is responsible and accountable to the people. Opposition party workers were harassed, their meetings disrupted, public protests and demonstrations against the government were declared illegal, and there was a law which limited the rights of the citizens to criticize the government. The media, television, radio and newspapers were controlled by the ruling party. Nothing could be published against the ruling party, and the newspapers did not have the freedom to publish anything against the government, and everything was censored by the party in power. Even the judiciary was not strong and independent. One of the basic features in a democracy is a strong independent judiciary without which impartial judgment is impossible. So in Zimbabwe, Mugabe controlled the judiciary, ignored the court judgments that went against the government, and pressurized the judges to give a verdict which did not go against him. So, we see that the government in Zimbabwe was undemocratic and autocratic. Citizens did not enjoy the basic rights like freedom of opinion and expression, freedom to protest and participate in political action. There was no independent judiciary to protect the rights of the citizens. In a democracy, rights of the citizens have a lot of importance, which was not there. Citizens did not enjoy even basic rights of freedom of speech and expression. Based on our discussion about Zimbabwe, we conclude the fourth feature of democracy, that is, a democratic government rules within the limits set by constitutional law and citizens' rights. If the government does not rule within the limits set by the constitution, the government will become absolute. If the government does not respect the rights of the citizens, it cannot be called a true democracy. So, having read about Pakistan, China, Saudi Arabia, Estonia and Fiji and Zimbabwe, we have come to know about the four important features of democracy. We began the chapter with a simple definition of democracy as a form of government in which the rulers are elected by the people. But we have seen in the countries that we discussed that just rulers being elected by the people was not adequate. It was not enough for a country to be termed a democracy. So the four important features of democracy are: the rulers elected by the people must have the power to take all major decisions. Elections must offer a choice and a fair opportunity to the people to change their current rulers and bring new people to power. This choice and opportunity should be available to all citizens on an equal basis, which is universal adult franchise. And the exercise of this choice leads to a government limited by basic rules of the Constitution and citizens' rights. As we have come to the end of the first part of this chapter, we already know the four important features of democracy. Let us recapitulate what we have learned today. The first question is, what was the legal framework order issued by General Musharraf? It gave him the power to dismiss the national and provincial assemblies in Pakistan. Who had the real power in Pakistan under Musharraf? It was definitely not the people. General Musharraf and the military officers enjoyed the sole decision-making powers. Name the Parliament of China. National People's Congress is the Chinese Parliament. What kind of party system does China have, and which is the party in power? China has a single party system and the Communist Party of China is in power. The next question is, which party came to power in Zimbabwe after independence and who was its leader? The ZANU-PF party came to power and it was led by Robert Mugabe. The next question is, what is the fundamental principle of democracy? The fundamental principle of democracy is the principle of political equality. Complete the sentence given. A democratic government has to rule within. As we discussed in the case of Zimbabwe, a democratic country has to rule within the limits set by the constitutional law and citizens' rights. Question number 1. Pakistan under General Pervez Musharraf cannot be called a true democracy. Give reasons. Question number 2. Mention 3 instances of denial of equal right to vote to citizens. Question number 3. Mention 3 features of democracy. That is all for today. We shall continue to learn about the arguments in favor of democracy and against democracy, that is the merits and demerits of democracy, in our next class. Thank you.